Day 7. 0400 hours to 0800 hours. Spike closed his eyes again. He needed all his concentration to run the self-test on his level of functioning. He did not want the hunters to be aware of his renewed strength. Although he did not have the strength, even when fully functioning, to defeat one hunter in unarmed combat, he had the skill and training to give him an advantage, and he aimed to surprise them. He would go down fighting. The memory chips in his electronic brain were still badly damaged. However, he had 15% arm and leg functioning. The self-tests also indicated that his battery pack had only 20 minutes of power before termination. It had to be enough. The hunters were moving around him. He could feel the beating of their wings. The creatures by his side and much further away were howling into the night sky. He knew that this indicated they planned to attack. He couldn't feel any of the creatures pawing at his body. He listened carefully. There was the slight sound of undulating breath. He estimated that there was just one hunter. Trying to sense where the noise was coming from, he concluded that the creature was a meter north-northwest of his head. It had to be crouched down, about 1.5 meters off the ground. He couldn't open his eyes again. If it saw him do this, it would be alarmed and prepared. He would have one chance only. He silently prayed to the prime mover. As he came to the Amen, he tightened his body and then uncoiled like a spring, throwing his arms backwards into what he hoped was the creature's face. His fists slammed into flesh. He turned his head, opening his eyes as he twisted his body into a kneeling position. He raised his arms above his head and brought them down with the full force he could muster onto the hunter's face. It was the lead hunter. It seemed to have a surprised, almost shocked expression on its face. His plan had worked. As the hunter lay on the ground, he drove his fingers into the eyeballs. Blinded, the creature squirmed and tried to escape. But there would be no escape. Spike carried on the upward movement into the brain, and the creature shuddered and died. The android commander looked around. The hunters were attacking the castle. Hundreds of them were flying overhead, screeching and trying to land on the lone tower. Around him, the red weed had proceeded even further and was now only 10 meters from his position. Whatever had happened to this world? The paralysis had covered the plain and cast a dark shadow across the castle. This world did not have long to go before it was totally extinguished by the alien weed. He fell onto all fours and crawled over to the castle. It wasn't easy, moving through muddy grass on his stomach for 30 meters, but he had to make sure that he wasn't seen. He arrived at the base of the tower. Only 15 minutes left. He checked his holster. The laser pistol remained in place. He hadn't had time to use it when attacked by the shape-changer, and the hunters had shown no interest in it. He hoped it hadn't been damaged by the water. He looked up. The hunters were flying and attacking the ramparts. He couldn't see what was happening in the castle. There might be hundreds of defenders protecting Pandora's box. He pulled himself parallel to the wall, stretched out his arm and grabbed for a handhold. Putting his left foot on the wall, he began to climb the steep tower. The hunters seemed not to notice him. When they flew close by, he would stop moving and only restart when they had disappeared from view. Above him, it sounded as if a bloody and violent battle was going on for the possession of the battlements. Even if he could make it, he might be cut down by whoever won the fight. But that was a future problem. First, he had to climb to the top of the tower and survive the attention of the savages. 7 minutes left before termination. They had caught up with Elle. She was watching the final moments of the mining operation. She stood in the centre of a doorway to the courtyard, immobile and staring. She didn't seem to be concerned that she wasn't hidden from the shape-changer's sight. Lightning bolts were descending from the upper atmosphere and striking the top of the mining equipment. The machinery roared, sparks were flying everywhere. The room was bathed in a fiery glow. Thomas grabbed hold of Elle's shoulders. "Come on, we've got to get her out of here," Thomas said. "Where to?" Bernice asked. Swarf was running around. He was shouting orders at the lead Chthon. The Chthon was cowering and seemed to be afraid of the bright lights. Suddenly, all noise stopped. The vapour started to rise upwards towards the hole in the roof, and a hissing sound echoed around the chamber. Swarf turned in triumph. "Within moments, we will have broken through the fabric of another universe." The room started to shake. It felt as if the castle was sitting on top of a rocket about to explode. In the mist, Bernice could see glimpses of something. It was difficult to distinguish exactly what she was seeing, but she had never seen its like before. The mist swirled. If it was one creature, it was a gargantuan beast. Its body resembled a huge serpent, with spikes and billowing dragon-like wings. Its reptilian head was lean, with dozens of eyes square in the forehead, savage teeth, long languid tongue, and small horns bulging from the crown. As she stared, the beast seemed to take on many forms. Glimpses. Was it one monster or a myriad? She thought she could see painted wings, like a death's head moth, claws, wet feathers. Perhaps there were smaller creatures clinging to the main body, or maybe flying things hovering around the beast. Whatever the beast was, it rose up above the machinery, through the hole in the roof, and hundreds of meters into the heavens. "What is it?" Swarf was staring up. He obviously hadn't been expecting this. "You have opened up a gateway to the abyss," shouted the Chthon. A scream seemed to come from a passageway, isolated shouts and cries of terror. "The castle is empty," Bernice told herself. She shivered. Her breath condensed in the cold air. Elle started to walk forward. Swarf turned to her, surprised. What was she doing here? The woman had been locked in the dungeons. It didn't make sense. She stood in front of the shape-changer. She had no fear. "We have broken through," Swarf said, trying to understand what was going on. "I disagreed when my husband employed you. Why did the followers need street scum like you to do our work? We suspected that you would try to double-cross us. So we tempted you with Dream B. But it's not the drugs we want." Elle smiled. "The Time Lords were fools all those centuries ago to think that my masters would simply rest and die." "What do you want?" Swarf struggled to ask the question. "You have opened up the Well of Souls," Elle said. "We shall release the masters from their imprisonment. Soon, darkness will fall over the whole of creation." "No!" Swarf shouted. Copyion stood. The typewriter creature had been watching the events unfolding in the throne room. "It is time," Copyion said, walking over to the ceremonial robes. "The enemy has revealed itself. We must move." Copyion knelt down in front of the garments, spoke several words to himself, and stood. An ancient cloak was slung over his shoulders, a pointed skullcap covered his head, and an impressive bejewelled sword was slipped into a sheath at the front of his body. He picked up an amulet and placed it over his head. The amulet showed a worm curling around a globe. It was similar to that worn by the Fellowship in Victorian London. "Doctor," Blake pointed out the design to the Time Lord. "It is a charm," Copyion stated. "The ancients believed that you could use evil to ward off evil." He walked over to the yellow flag. With great effort, he picked it up and held it above his head. He looked across at the doctor and nodded. Copyion began to walk down the corridor towards the unknown. Bernice watched the unfolding drama with fascination. A young wife talking to a shape-changer. He appeared nervous and confused, continually glancing up at the beast forming in the smoke above him. The lone Chthon lay on the floor, praying. It seemed uninterested, appearing to be deaf to the cries for help. The shape-changer had been calling out for the other Chthons, but there had been no reply. Bernice presumed that they were all dead. Her head was spinning. Ghost-like apparitions drifted through her mind. Creatures which were neither fish, flesh, nor fowl, but amorphous mutations and diseased imaginings. Back on Nicaea, the followers have been conducting sacrifices to celebrate the return of the Ancient Ones, El said. The shape-changer was swinging his arms desperately, as if fighting off invisible hordes. Bernice could see nothing near him, but he was screaming and shouting. They will leave this planet and once more expand across the universe, El continued, ignoring what was going on around her. Bernice felt a light tap on her shoulder. She turned. I know what to do, Thomas said. Bernice didn't know how to respond. The android was trying to communicate something to her. He started to say. The castle shuddered again, sending the people sprawling. El stumbled. Thomas took a long look at Bernice, then ran towards the shape-changer. El seemed to be expecting the attack. She deftly stepped out of his way. The android attacked. 2 punches hit their target. The dwarf looked surprised. He tried to crawl across the floor away from the android. Thomas slammed his arm down on the shape-changer's back. The dwarf seemed winded. Thomas fell on his knees and began to strangle the squirming figure. But it didn't matter how hard the android squeezed, it had no effect on the neck muscles of the shape-changer. He turned his head unnaturally to face the android, just a little further than was normally possible. "If this is the gateway to hell," he started to say. The body began to transform. The android couldn't hold it anymore and fell onto the floor. A huge dog, the size of a horse, stood in the room. It had 3 heads, all barking and dripping saliva. "No!" Thomas shouted. He struck out with his arm, blinding one of the heads, but the ferocity of the creature was too much. The hellhound plunged its savage teeth into the android's body. The chest and neck were torn away. The android stopped moving. Bernice looked away. The rabid attack was over in seconds. "Oh, android, what was your life but a hollow shell?" El asked. "But the lives of mortal creatures are no different than those of metal men. There is no purpose." The dog continued to growl as the mist drifted around it. It snarled, barking at the barely visible monsters. "Leave me alone!" it shouted, transforming back into the dwarf. The wispy creatures continued to torment him. He waved his arms over his head. Behind the shape-changer, Bernice could see a more ominous sight. The red weed had broken through the wall. It covered an area of about 3 square meters and was advancing rapidly. An eerie stillness had taken hold of that end of the throne room. The Chthon was huddled on the floor. He was hiding his face. El walked over and knelt in front of him. "Chopra, can you hear the voices?" El asked. His hearing was obviously better than that of Bernice. She couldn't hear anything, but the Chthon's face tightened and showed him to be listening to some barely audible sounds. "They're coming," El said, "and they're calling your name." She held her arms wide and looked like she was about to cuddle him. "Who are you?" Chopra asked. "I am known by many names, but you know me as the Empire that never ended." She paused, held the Chthon's head, and suddenly twisted it. There was a click, and his inert body fell to the floor. "I am Death." El turned away from the dead body of the Chthon. She looked up at the monstrous form rising above her. Copyion walked, as if taking part in a ceremonial state occasion. Each step was taken like part of a dance to some long-lost plan. Copyion held the flag, bearing the ancient heritage of Gallifrey. He walked along the corridors and out of the space station. He was silent, his mind elsewhere. Blake looked around. Darkness had fallen. However, the planet was stained deep red, as if a bloody wound had opened and poured forth over the length and breadth of the land. There was a stillness, dreadful and intense, which appeared to have taken possession of the alien world. "What is it?" Blake asked. "It is a contamination seeping through the hole," Copyion replied. "In the 7 days since the shape changes started their experiments, it has spread rapidly and now become a deluge. They have been used." "Could this be the fate of the universe?" the Doctor asked. "Yes," Copyion said. "How are we going to walk through the weed?" Blake asked. "You don't have to fear. I have been expecting this moment. This path has been created for centuries to allow a safe passage through the Red Death." "Gallifreyan technology?" the Doctor asked. "And prayer," Copyion replied. They walked along a symmetrical path stretching from the Gallifreyan space station to the age-old castle. Copyion told them not to try and touch the weed. It would destroy their souls. In the Stygian gloom, hundreds, if not thousands of hunters flew overhead, screeching and crying out. However, Blake's eyes were drawn to an image growing in size and intensity, apparently reaching out to the heavens. He couldn't tell if it was one of the creatures that had attacked them in the other world, but he could sense an ancient evil thriving and pulsating as it looked out across the planets, stars, and galaxies. The eyes seemed to stare at him. Blake felt a coldness. The Doctor pushed him. "You must keep moving," the Doctor said. There were only seconds left. Spike was confused. His mind and body were no longer coordinated. He had stumbled over the wall onto the parapet of the castle. 2 Chthons lay dead, their insides gouged out. They had stood no chance against the hunters. The flying creatures now seemed more interested in the shape forming in the sky. Spike's energy level was so low that he could barely walk down the long stairway. He had to succeed. The pain was intense. If he just gave up and lay down, then he would have eternal rest. He was aware of the thoughts, but continued to struggle. He found a doorway and tried to point his dying body in that direction. His feet didn't answer to his commands, and he felt his body collapse onto the floor. There was still energy left in his arms. He crawled along the stone floor and managed to go through the doorway. Although his strength was rapidly deteriorating, he continued, dragging himself along a corridor. He found himself on a balcony above the throne room. Down below, he could see one of the shape changes and a woman he could not identify. And there was also Bernice. She had survived. He felt sorrow. He could see machinery. A dark mist was rising out of a hole in the roof of the castle. He wondered if it was the strange shape which was so attracting the hunters. He didn't know and didn't care. He had seen the missile. It was powering the machinery. 9 seconds, and he would be terminated. He pulled himself up and aimed the gun. He staggered around, dizzy. Suddenly, a scream shattered his final moments. He looked down. Her eyes protruded, and her right arm pointed accusingly at him. "No!" she screamed. He looked back at the missile and pulled the trigger. The gun discharged a high-energy bolt, but he couldn't see or hear. His body crumpled onto the floor, and as he fell, he sensed a tremendous blast of heat burn his skin. He smiled. A fiery light radiated out like an exploding sun. The castle exploded. Stone and rubble were blasted into the sky, and the tower was ripped off and collapsed onto the ground. The 3 travellers were thrown off their feet and pushed backwards by the sheer force of the shockwave. The Doctor told Blake to cover his head and wait until the disturbance settled down. The very earth seemed to be shaking, as if roaring out in protest. The air was scorching, and Blake found it difficult to breathe. It soon became bitingly cold, as the air was sucked into the inferno which had been the Dark Castle. And then everything seemed still. Blake looked around him. Smoke was rising from the ashes of the ruin. The shape that had been forming in their universe was no more. The red weed had turned an insipid chalk colour, and was withering all around them. Blake picked up some rubble from the castle and threw it at the weed. The stone landed, and the weed crumbled into dust. The parasite was no longer a threat to their safety. Copyion stood. He looked puzzled. "What happened?" the doctor asked. Copyion shrugged. Blake, pointing around them, asked, "Is it over?" Copyion shook his head.